Romeo and Juliet was one of Shakespeare's first plays as a playwright, and it is now known as one of his most iconic plays. It shows the love story between these two characters. The influences for Romeo and Juliet come from an extended poem where Shakespeare takes two of the characters and creates the play itself. The play is set in the Elizabethan era, where Queen Elizabeth herself had insecurities about her rulership. She wanted to be more masculine, and we see how Shakespeare has incorporated this by implementing a patriarchal society. Ideas such as religion were really important in the Elizabethan society, and Shakespeare has too included this in his play, through characters such as the friar himself and the role that he plays in wedding Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare also shows how family, honour and reputation are included in his play, through the characters of Romeo and Juliet themselves and how they both go against their families to create this ideal love story. We see both characters defy the social norms and go against their family and their family's reputation to fulfill their love. The play opens on the streets of Verona, where we have the Montague family and the Capulet family involved in a street brawl. This means that the Prince of Verona comes out and informs both families that the next person to start a fight will be exiled or killed from Verona. This shows the extent of hatred between both the families. We then see Romeo being lovesick over Rosaline, who he has just broken up with. To try and cheer him up, Romeo's friends Benvolio and Mercutio invite him to the Capulet ball. Now, not knowing that Juliet is an enemy, Romeo sees Juliet for the first time and they both fall in love. It is because of this love they both meet the friar, who they ask to get them married. Whilst this romance is short-lived and irrational, both claim that they are heavily in love with one another. As Juliet was supposed to marry Paris, she decides to keep her wedding to Romeo a secret, only telling the nurse who looks after her. Romeo and a group of the others go out to celebrate his wedding to Juliet. When they are celebrating, they encounter Tybalt, who is Juliet's cousin, and gets engaged in another street brawl. This leads to the death of Mercutio, Romeo's friend. To avenge his death, Romeo gets into another fight with Tybalt, and after a long time, Tybalt is also killed. As Romeo is responsible for the death of Tybalt, he is exiled and told to leave Verona immediately. Juliet goes home and finds out from her dad that she is due to marry Paris, as her dad does not already know that she's married to Romeo. Juliet is conflicted and runs to the friar for help. The friar comes up with a plan where Juliet will pretend to take a sleeping potion so that everyone thinks that she is dead. Upon waking the next morning, Romeo will come and find her, and Romeo and Juliet will leave Verona together. This plan does not go as expected, as Juliet turns up in her tomb and is lying there dead. However, Romeo does not get delivered the message and thinks that Juliet is actually dead. It's because of this Romeo commits suicide and kills himself, right in the moment where Juliet starts to waking up. At this point in the play, both characters, Romeo and Juliet, die, and their families come together and promise not to have any other arguments between them and end the animosity that has been going on for several years. Capulet and Lady Capulet are two of the most important characters in the play Romeo and Juliet. They are the parents of Juliet herself. At the beginning of the play, we see Capulet being very protective and loving towards his daughter Juliet, as she is their only child. However, as the play progresses, we see Capulet becoming more of your typical Elizabethan man with his dominant nature. Another key character in the play is Romeo himself. Romeo is a typical Petrarchan lover, where his love for Rosaline is unrequited and he has to live with this. We see Romeo being very lovesick at the beginning of the play and not knowing what to do with himself since breaking up with Rosaline. However, as soon as he meets Juliet at the ball, he falls immediately in love with her, and as the audience we question if his love is actually true throughout the play. Romeo is also quite a peaceful character, however it's ironic as he is the one who ends up killing Tybalt. Another main character that we see in the play is the character of Juliet. Juliet defies the gender norms and the expectations of Elizabethan women. She does this by choosing her own partner in marriage and not listening to what her father decides for her. At the beginning of the play, Juliet is completely opposed to the idea of marriage and men. However, as soon as she meets Romeo, we see this develop as the play goes on. In her famous soliloquy, she discusses how she feels like a child with new robes and new clothes when the idea of marriage is brought to her, showing the change in her character and her ideas on love. At the beginning of the play, we also see Juliet being very timid and not as brave. However, after meeting Romeo, she makes some strong decisions that impact the rest of her life. Another character that we see in the play is the character of the nurse. The nurse acts like a mother figure for Juliet and looks after her. In the Elizabethan times, wealthy women would not look after their own children, and this is where the character of the nurse comes in. At times, we can argue that Juliet is much more closer to the nurse than her own mother, and the conversations that she has are more likely to be had with the nurse than her mother. Juliet actually feels really uncomfortable around her own mother, but her relationship with the nurse is much more positive. The nurse speaks in prose, which means an uneducated Elizabethan audience could all understand what she is saying, as she seems like a more common character. Another important character in the play is Friar Lawrence. The friar himself, being from the Elizabethan society, they would have trusted in him and respected his decisions, as the majority of the society were Catholics. The friar plays an important part in wedding Romeo and Juliet, as no one else is in attendance. Their marriage takes place off stage, which shows us that the friar may be doubtful of his decisions. We also see the friar's motives of getting Romeo and Juliet married to restore peace in both families. Therefore, it could be argued that, alongside the nurse, the friar is ultimately to blame for their death. One of the key themes in Romeo and Juliet is the theme of love. There are many different forms of love that the play takes. We have friendship, family, and parental love. The idea of the love between Romeo and Juliet can be seen as very irrational. Where Romeo was in love with Rosaline only a few days before, he falls in love with Juliet. This puts into question their relationship. And where Juliet is so young and naive, her age plays a part in the irrationality of their love. We also see the idea of love shown in Capulet and Juliet's relationship. At the beginning of the play, Capulet is a loving father towards Juliet and has her best interests at heart. However, later on in the play, when he decides that Juliet must marry Paris, he goes against his initial word, showing that he is retracted on what he would say and perhaps not looking out for Juliet. Another important theme in the play is the theme of hate and death. The prologue signifies that there will be a death later on in the play, which already keeps the audience on edge. We see that both families, the Montagues and the Capulets, are not supportive of Romeo and Juliet's relationship and therefore could be held responsible for their ultimate death. We also see the theme of gender and age being shown in the play. Shakespeare shows a very patriarchal society, and because of this, the women aren't free to express themselves. This is something that was prominent within the Elizabethan era. Shakespeare also shows that despite Juliet being only 14 years old, she is quite mature for her age, therefore showing how there is contrast between the older and younger generation and their ways of thinking. An important motif that we see in the play is the motif of plants and poison. Juliet uses the plant to fake her own death, and because of which leads to Romeo's death. An Elizabethan audience would have thought that this was very dangerous, as their belief in God signified how no one should be going and using science to oppose God. We can see that because of Juliet doing so, it has a negative impact on her, which would reiterate to the Elizabethan audiences to not do this and stick to their religious faith. Shakespeare structures the play to have 5 acts. Within these 5 acts, he opens the play with the prologue. In the prologue, it gives the audience an outline of what is to come in the play. As an Elizabethan audience wouldn't be very educated, for the majority of them, the prologue would set out the tone for the rest of the play. In the prologue, we are told that there will be deaths within the play, and actually this foreshadows Romeo and Juliet's ultimate death. The prologue also signifies negative things that are yet to come. Shakespeare's use of iambic pentameter throughout the play helps the audience who aren't educated to keep up with the pace and the tone of what's happening. Romeo and Juliet often, when they are speaking to each other and professing their love for one another, use iambic pentameter. This is a way of them expressing their love, but also hiding perhaps the negativity that could be associated with it.